James Garner spent decades building a reputation as one of Hollywood's most beloved gentlemen. With his easy charm and straightforward honesty, he navigated the treacherous waters of show business while maintaining his dignity and integrity. But there was one relationship that troubled him throughout his career, one story he kept mostly to himself until late in life. That relationship was with Steve McQueen, the iconic actor whose name became synonymous with cool masculinity and rebellious charisma. When Garner finally spoke openly about their time working together, his words were shockingly blunt and revealed a side of Hollywood that few people ever saw. If you're interested in the real stories behind Hollywood's golden age, the untold truths about your favorite stars, and the complicated relationships that shaped cinema history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another fascinating deep dive into the lives of Hollywood legends. The man the world knew as James Garner was born James Scott Bumgarner on April 7, 1928, in Norman, Oklahoma. His early years were marked by hardship and tragedy that would have broken many people. The Great Depression had devastated communities across America, and the Bumgarner family struggled like so many others. When James was just 5 years old, his mother died during a botched abortion procedure. It was a traumatic loss that left him and his brothers without the nurturing presence every child needs. His father tried to hold the family together, but grief and financial pressure took their toll. After his hardware store burned down, he turned to alcohol to cope with his pain, and eventually remarried a woman named Wilma, who would make young James's life even more difficult. Wilma was cruel to her stepson in ways that left lasting scars. She subjected him to physical abuse and psychological torture, including the humiliation of forcing him to wear women's clothing. For years, James endured this treatment, but by the age of 14, his breaking point finally arrived. During one violent confrontation, he fought back in self-defense, and only his father's sudden intervention prevented the situation from escalating into something far worse. Shortly after this incident, his father abandoned the family completely, leaving James and his brothers to fend for themselves. It was a childhood that could have easily led to bitterness and anger, but somehow James found the resilience to keep moving forward. Without a stable home or much education, Garner took whatever work he could find. He pumped gas at service stations, laid carpet, and even worked as an underwear model to earn money. He briefly joined the Merchant Marines, hoping for adventure and a fresh start, but chronic seasickness cut that career short almost immediately. Then, in 1950, the United States Army drafted him to fight in the Korean War. His military service would prove both dangerous and formative. Just 2 days after arriving in Korea, he was wounded by shrapnel from enemy fire. Several months later, he was hit again, this time by friendly fire from American forces. These injuries earned him 2 Purple Hearts, though Garner rarely discussed his wartime experiences and consistently downplayed any suggestion that he had been heroic. There were strange moments during his deployment that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Garner had developed an intense aversion to garlic, and on one occasion, this dislike literally saved his life. A meal served to the troops had been poisoned, but Garner refused to eat it because it smelled strongly of garlic. Everyone who ate that meal became seriously ill. On another night, while standing guard duty, he caught the faint scent of garlic on the wind and immediately recognized it as a warning that enemy soldiers were nearby. His alert saved his entire unit from what would likely have been a devastating ambush. These experiences taught him to trust his instincts and showed him that survival often came down to paying attention to small details that others might miss. When Garner returned from the war, he had no clear plan for his future. Hollywood was not an obvious destination for a young man from Oklahoma with limited education and no connections to the entertainment industry. But a chance meeting changed everything. Paul Gregory, who would become his talent agent, saw something special in Garner and decided to take a chance on him. Gregory worked to get him small roles, including a non-speaking part in a production of the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial. These early opportunities were modest, but they gave Garner the experience he needed and gradually brought him to the attention of casting directors and producers who were always looking for fresh talent. His big break arrived in 1957 when he was cast as Brett Maverick in a new Western series simply called Maverick. The show was a risky proposition, scheduled against powerhouse programs like The Ed Sullivan Show that dominated television ratings. But Garner brought something special to the role. His sly wit, natural charisma, and ability to deliver comedy with perfect timing transformed Maverick into a runaway success. He became a household name almost overnight. Audiences loved his portrayal of the charming gambler who preferred to use his brains rather than his guns, who would rather run from a fight than risk his life unnecessarily. It was a refreshing change from the typical stoic Western hero, and viewers couldn't get enough of it. But Garner's integrity and strong sense of justice soon put him on a collision course with the Hollywood studio system. By 1960, he was not just the star of Maverick, he was the show's lifeblood. Everything that made the series special revolved around his performance. But Hollywood in those years operated on a ruthless business model that treated actors as commodities to be exploited. When a writer's strike brought television production to a halt, Warner Brothers saw an opportunity to cut costs at Garner's expense. Despite his rising stardom and the millions of dollars his show was earning for the studio, he was making just $1,250 a week. When the strike hit, the studio suddenly declared there was no work for him and stopped paying his salary. Garner saw the situation differently. His contract guaranteed payment whether scripts were available or not, and he believed the studio was exploiting the strike as an excuse to cheat him out of money he had rightfully earned. Most actors in that era would have backed down, fearful of being blacklisted in an industry that thrived on intimidation and retaliation. Studios had immense power, and crossing them could mean the end of a career. But Garner was not like most actors. Drawing on the stubborn resilience that had carried him through his abusive childhood and the Korean War, he made a decision that stunned Hollywood. He sued Warner Brothers for breach of contract. It was a daring and dangerous move. Stars simply didn't take on the major studios in open court. The power imbalance was too great, and the risk of career suicide seemed almost certain. Yet Garner pressed forward with his lawsuit, determined to stand up for what was right. Against all odds, he won. The victory established him not only as a star with genuine box office appeal, but as a man unwilling to bow to corporate power. Warner Brothers tried desperately to lure him back with promises of more money and better opportunities, but the damage had been done. Garner's trust in the studio system had been shattered, and he walked away, determined to carve his own path on his own terms.
For Warner Brothers, losing Garner was devastating. They scrambled to save their hit show, introducing new Maverick cousins played by actors like Roger Moore and Robert Colbert. But audiences weren't fooled. The magic of Maverick had always been Garner, and without him, the show's charm quickly faded. Ratings dropped, and the series never recovered its former glory. For most actors, stepping away from a hit television series at the height of its popularity would have been career suicide. But Garner refused to look back. He knew he was capable of more, and he was determined to prove it on the big screen. That chance came in 1963 with a war film that would become one of the most celebrated ensemble pictures of its era. The Great Escape told the story of Allied prisoners of war who engineered an ambitious escape from a German prison camp. The film featured an extraordinary cast, including Richard Attenborough, Charles Bronson, Donald Pleasance, James Garner, and Steve McQueen. It was on this production, behind the walls of a fictional German prison camp, that James Garner would meet Steve McQueen face to face and step into a rivalry that would haunt him for decades. When The Great Escape premiered at London's Leicester Square Odeon on June 20, 1963, critics and audiences hailed it as a triumph of ensemble storytelling. It became one of the most enduring war films of its era and remains widely beloved to this day. But behind the scenes, the production was marked by tension and conflict, especially between Garner and McQueen. At the time, Steve McQueen was rising fast in Hollywood, but he wasn't yet the highest-paid star on the set. Garner received $150,000 for his role as Bob Hendley, the resourceful scrounger, while McQueen earned $87,500 for playing Virgil Hiltz, the rebellious Cooler King. That pay gap did not sit well with McQueen, who was already developing a reputation for ego-driven demands and difficult behavior on set. McQueen had previously clashed with Yul Brynner during the filming of The Magnificent Seven, and his difficult behavior followed him to Germany. He isolated himself from the rest of the cast, staying at a private chalet rather than bonding with his fellow actors. He arrived to work each day in a studio-hired Rolls-Royce, emphasizing his status and separating himself from the ensemble atmosphere the film required. He complained bitterly and constantly about his character, arguing that Hiltz wasn't heroic enough and that the scripted scenes made him look foolish compared to the other prisoners. His dissatisfaction grew so intense that at one point he threatened to walk off the production entirely, which would have been a disaster for the film. Director John Sturges found himself in an impossible position. He even considered rewriting the entire film to make Garner the central character instead, which would have fundamentally changed the story. But Garner, ever the steady and professional presence, took a different approach. He sat down with McQueen privately to find out what the real problem was. McQueen admitted that he didn't like being overshadowed by other actors and wanted his character to shine more prominently. To pacify him and save the production, Sturges restructured significant portions of the script. He added motorcycle stunts that would become iconic and reframed Hiltz as the daring scout who risked capture to bring back vital intelligence about the surrounding territory. It was a compromise that ultimately worked for the film, but it exposed McQueen's deep insecurities about his place in the Hollywood hierarchy. The irony of the situation was that McQueen couldn't even complete the movie's most iconic stunt himself. The legendary barbed wire motorcycle jump that became the film's signature moment was attempted by McQueen during rehearsals, but he crashed. Unable to perform the dangerous leap safely, the production turned to McQueen's friend Bud Eakins, an accomplished stunt rider who ultimately performed the jump while riding a 1962 Triumph Thunderbird disguised to look like a wartime military motorcycle. Audiences cheered for what they believed was McQueen's daring athleticism, completely unaware that the most famous scene in his career wasn't actually his achievement at all. Garner would later recall these behind-the-scenes battles with a mixture of candor and regret. To him, the experience revealed something fundamental about the difference between a true actor and a movie star. McQueen wasn't interested in disappearing into different characters or exploring the depths of human emotion. He carried the same macho persona from role to role, relying on his image rather than his craft. As Garner once put it with devastating simplicity, that approach was the kiss of death as far as he was concerned. Those words revealed a wound that had lingered for decades, even as the two men maintained what could be described as an uneasy friendship. James Garner was not a man who often spoke ill of others. Throughout his long career, he was known across Hollywood as easygoing, kind, and deeply professional. He preferred to let his work speak for itself and avoided the gossip and backbiting that consumed so many in the entertainment industry. But when it came to Steve McQueen, his patience had limits. Decades after The Great Escape, in his 2011 memoir titled The Garner Files, he finally revealed what he had thought all along. His words shocked fans because they were as blunt as they were damning, coming from a man who had maintained his dignity and discretion for so many years. Garner wrote that, like Marlon Brando, McQueen could be a pain in the ass on set, but unlike Marlon Brando, he wasn't really an actor. All he was a movie star, a poser who cultivated the image of a macho man and brought that same persona to every role he played. People loved it, Garner acknowledged, but you could always see him acting. That was the kiss of death as far as Garner was concerned. For Garner, this wasn't a petty jab or jealous criticism. It was an honest, professional critique from one craftsman about another. He had watched McQueen closely during the filming of The Great Escape, witnessing the tantrums, the sulking, and the constant demands for more screen time and better lines. To him, it was the behavior of a man deeply insecure about his place in the Hollywood hierarchy, someone who needed constant validation and reassurance. Even McQueen's wife at the time, Neil Adams, confided in Garner about his husband's struggles. She described his jealousy, his paranoia, and his suspicions of infidelity that had absolutely no basis in reality. Garner listened sympathetically, but recognized these as signs of deeper insecurity that no amount of fame or success could cure. He contrasted McQueen's limitations with the talents of true actors he respected, like Marlon Brando. Even though Brando could be difficult and demanding, his artistry was undeniable. He disappeared into his characters and created performances of genuine depth and complexity. McQueen, by comparison, seemed to be hiding behind a carefully constructed image, one that audiences adored, but that fellow performers recognized as hollow and one-dimensional. It was a harsh assessment, but Garner was far from alone in his opinion. Paul Newman, who co-starred with McQueen in The Towering Inferno in 1974, famously dismissed him with a single crude expletive, calling him an asshole for constantly competing over lines and billing. Paul Newman was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, secure in his talent and status, yet even he found McQueen's behavior exhausting and unprofessional. The pattern was clear to those who worked closely with him. McQueen's insecurities drove him to compete rather than collaborate, to see every project as a battle for dominance rather than an opportunity to create something meaningful together.
And yet, for all his frustrations, Garner never claimed to hate McQueen. He understood that the insecurities driving McQueen's difficult behavior were deeply rooted in his own troubled past. Garner treated him less like a rival and more like a troubled younger brother who needed patience and understanding even when he didn't deserve it. Remarkably, they remained friends throughout their lives, bound by a strange mutual respect that transcended their professional differences. In the years before his death from cancer in 1980, McQueen reached out to old colleagues, including Yul Brynner, to ask forgiveness for his behavior on various film sets. It was a gesture of humility and self-awareness that came too late to repair all the damage, but showed that he recognized his own flaws. Garner never carried a grudge, but the truth once spoken was impossible to take back, and his honest assessment of McQueen's limitations would become part of Hollywood history. While the shadow of Steve McQueen lingered in Hollywood gossip and behind-the-scenes stories, James Garner was busy building a legacy of his own that would ultimately prove far more enduring. In 1974, he stepped into the role that would define his career and cement his place in television history. Jim Rockford in The Rockford Files was created by Roy Huggins and Stephen J. Cannell as a modern-day spin on the Maverick spirit that Garner had perfected years earlier. Rockford was a down-on-his-luck private investigator living in a modest trailer parked by the beach in Los Angeles. He wasn't invincible or glamorous like the detectives audiences were used to seeing. He was broke more often than not, frequently conned by the people he tried to help, sometimes beaten up by criminals and corrupt cops alike, but always clever enough to survive and solve the case. Audiences loved him for it because he felt like one of them, a regular person trying to make his way in a difficult world. The show was a massive success from the very beginning, eventually winning Garner an Emmy Award and cementing him as one of television's most beloved leading men. But behind the charm and humor that made the show work, the role was systematically destroying his body. Garner insisted on doing most of his own stunts, especially the elaborate car chases that became the show's trademark. He had already developed a passion for automobiles and racing while filming the 1966 racing epic Grand Prix, and he poured that enthusiasm into Rockford's iconic gold Pontiac Firebird. Week after week, he performed dangerous stunts, crashed cars, fought with stuntmen, and pushed his body to its absolute limits. The endless crashes, fights, and physical demands left lasting damage that would plague him for the rest of his life. His knees and back deteriorated season after season. Doctors warned him repeatedly to slow down and let stunt doubles handle the dangerous work. But Garner pushed on, unwilling to compromise the authenticity that made the show work so well. By 1980, the physical toll had become too great to ignore. The Rockford Files ended not just because of rising production costs, but because Garner's body simply couldn't take it anymore. Yet his struggles with the show didn't end when filming stopped. For years afterward, he battled Universal Studios in court, accusing them of using creative accounting to cheat him out of profits from the show he had made successful. The legal fight dragged on for 8 exhausting years before he finally won a substantial settlement, though the exact amount was kept confidential as part of the agreement. It was a victory that vindicated his stand for fair treatment, but it came at a tremendous personal cost. The stress, bitterness, and constant reminder that Hollywood executives cared more about profit margins than the people who created their content took an emotional toll. His health continued to decline in later years as the accumulated damage from decades of stunt work caught up with him. He underwent open-heart surgery in 1988, a serious procedure that required months of recovery. In 2008, he suffered a severe stroke that slowed him down permanently and limited his ability to work.
But through all these challenges, Garner's reputation as one of Hollywood's most genuine and respected figures endured. He was admired not just for his memorable roles and professional accomplishments, but for his loyalty and decency. He remained married to his wife Lois Clark for nearly 60 decades, a remarkable achievement in a business notorious for broken relationships and serial marriages. Together, they raised 2 daughters and maintained a family life that was remarkably stable and normal despite the pressures of fame. By the time James Garner reached his final years, the public saw him as a symbol of grace and decency in a business often dominated by ego and scandal. But behind that polished reputation were decades of pain and struggle, scars both physical and emotional that he carried with quiet dignity. His body bore the price of his commitment to authenticity and his refusal to compromise. The chronic knee and back injuries, the lingering effects of his heart surgery, and the stroke that robbed him of much of his mobility were all consequences of choices he had made to give audiences performances they could believe in. Still, he never complained publicly. Garner faced his health challenges the same way he had faced the studio executives who tried to cheat him, with grit, determination, and a dry sense of humor that never left him even in his darkest moments. His personal life remained far more stable and fulfilling than most of his peers ever experienced. His marriage to Lois Clark since 1956 avoided the scandals and infidelities that destroyed many Hollywood relationships. Despite Garner's demanding career and long hours on set, family remained at the center of his life and provided him with the grounding and perspective that so many actors lacked. It was this stability and sense of what truly mattered that perhaps made him so different from Steve McQueen. Where McQueen was restless, insecure, and constantly chasing approval from audiences and critics, Garner sought peace and stability, choosing honesty over image and substance over style. Even in his later reflections and interviews, Garner never softened his assessment of McQueen or walked back the criticisms he had made in his memoir. To him, the younger actor represented both the best and worst of Hollywood. McQueen was immensely talented at capturing audience attention and projecting an image of rebellious masculinity that resonated with millions of fans. But when stripped of that cultivated cool and examined as a craftsman, he seemed hollow and limited. That kiss of death phrase, referring to McQueen's reliance on persona rather than character work, was a critique that carried even more weight coming from a man who had fought for integrity his entire life and never compromised his principles for easy success. On July 19, 2014, James Garner passed away at his home at the age of 86 from a heart attack. The news hit fans hard, not because it was entirely unexpected, since his health had been failing for years, but because it marked the end of an era. He had been there for decades, a familiar and comforting face on television and in films, a steady presence in a rapidly changing world. His loss left a void not just in Hollywood, but in the hearts of audiences who had grown up with him, who had followed him from Maverick to The Great Escape to the Rockford Files and beyond.
Looking back on his remarkable career, James Garner's life was a study in contrasts and contradictions. He was a man who smiled easily and projected warmth and charm, yet carried the weight of childhood trauma that would have broken most people. He played charming heroes on screen who always seemed to land on their feet, but lived with constant physical pain from injuries sustained doing his own stunts. Though he rarely spoke ill of others and maintained a reputation for kindness and professionalism, when he finally broke his silence about Steve McQueen, his words cut through decades of myth-making to reveal a harsher truth about Hollywood stardom. It was a final reminder that behind all the glamour and celebrity, even the brightest stars are deeply human, flawed, and fragile. James Garner's honesty pulled back the curtain on Steve McQueen in a way that few others dared to do while both men were alive. His assessment was harsh, but came from a place of professional integrity and genuine understanding of what acting required. The question remains open for debate among film historians and fans. Was McQueen truly just a movie star playing himself in every role, or was he a misunderstood actor caught in his own insecurities and unable to break free from the image that made him famous? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, but Garner's perspective offers valuable insight from someone who worked alongside him and witnessed his behavior firsthand. Whatever conclusion we reach,
Both men left indelible marks on cinema history, though in very different ways, and their complicated relationship reminds us that the reality behind Hollywood's golden age was often far more complex than the images projected on screen.